Response bias. Response bias is a systematic tendency to respond in a certain way to questions. If you've made it through the psychology game this far, you know that a big thing we think about in psychological research is bias and how we can reduce biases in the studies that we conduct. Today we'll be talking about different forms of response bias and how we might correct for these biases in different studies related to culture. When we talk about response bias, we often talk about it in terms of psychological surveys, and specifically surveys that use Likert scales. Now, what the survey might ask you to do is rate each of these questions or statements on what is known as a Likert type scale, or simply a scale that ranges between certain discrete numbers that represents how you agree or disagree or strongly or not strongly feel about something. So in terms of response bias, we'll be thinking mainly in terms of Likert scale kind of survey items. There are many different types of biases that the chapter references or mentions. Today, we're only going to be talking about two of these as an example. These two being extremity and moderacy bias. So let's talk about extremity bias first. An extremity bias is the tendency to only or to mostly choose numbers towards the ends of a scale. So someone that demonstrates an extremity bias might have a selection that looks something like this. So you can see they're only using like 1 and 7, or maybe even like 2 and 1 and 6 and 7. But generally, their responses might cluster towards the end of the scale, whereas someone that has a moderacy bias might cluster their numbers towards the center of the scale, not leaning towards completely one way or the other. If they lean towards disagree, that it'd be very rare for them to say strongly disagree. Now, this bias can exist for a variety of different reasons. One reason could be cultural differences, right? Maybe in certain cultures, it's more normative there, or it's more valued there to always be completely concrete and either say, yes, I'm completely for this, or no, I'm completely against that. Maybe that's part of a value system that's central to that culture. Whereas in another culture, it's more valued to not show extremity, to be more moderate in the way you think, act, feel, and behave. And in those cultures, it might be a taboo to really say, no, I absolutely hate this. Think about maybe the Midwest, where people here might be a little more polite and might not ever want to say that, no, I hate what you're doing and you're completely wrong. Instead, they might say, oh, yeah, sure, that's interesting. So depending on culture, you could have different reasons why you're showing this bias. A question for us, though, is how we can address this bias. How can we correct for it if we see it potentially happening or can anticipate it happening before we collect data? Well, there are a variety of solutions that you can employ, but one solution might be using a forced choice paradigm. Basically, instead of giving a Likert scale item, where you give them options 1 through 7 or whatever it is, you force everyone to select no or yes. That way, those that select, or those that demonstrate a moderacy bias, or those that demonstrate an extremity bias, are kind of equalized with people that aren't. No matter what you're answering, you're still falling on the no side. So you lump all together the people that say no, and if you're still answering yes, to various degrees, you're still answering yes, so you lump together everyone that basically says yes, agree. So that might be one way we address for it. But in the chapter, there are definitely a lot of different ways you might correct or change your study to address this type of bias. Another bias you might encounter when doing research is what's known as the reference group effect. Now, this effect is basically when people make implicit social comparisons when they're trying to rank something on a scale. So implicit meaning, it's not something they directly think about, it's not something they do on purpose, but it's something that just kind of happens when you think about a question. So, for example, let's say we ask a question of, how tall are you? And on a scale of 1 to 7, we ask you to rank. Do you feel like 1, you're very short, or 7, very tall? Ignore for now how terrible of a question this is. But your answer to this question might be affected by the reference group effect. So if you live in a culture where everyone is really tall, you might say that you're relatively short. Despite everyone towering above you as 8 feet and you're 7 feet tall yourself, you're like, well, I'm still a foot under everyone else around me. So gosh, yeah, I feel really short. So I would say a 1. Whereas someone in another culture, let's say in their culture, the average height is very short. And they're like standing tall at 4 feet, where everyone, for some reason, is 2 feet tall. They're like 2 feet taller than everyone around them. Again, hypotheticals here. But that person who's 4 feet tall, comparing themselves to everyone else in their culture, that they don't really know anyone from another culture, might say, 7, yes, I'm 4 feet tall. I'm a giant among my people. So this would kind of illustrate a reference group effect, where depending on how you ask the question might vary depending on the cultural context and how people are comparing themselves to people within their context, people that they know, people that they are around day to day. So likewise, one thing we might want to think about is, how do we address this, right? How do we address a reference group effect? Well, there are 3 different ways. One way, you could provide specific scenarios when you ask your question on a survey. So for example, you might say something like, in general, how helpful do you feel you are in this situation? How helpful do you feel you are in that situation? Or if you were to do this specific thing or see this specific thing, how would you react? So providing more specific scenarios or examples. Another way you might address for this is ask for just a very discrete, quantitative response. Instead of asking generally, yeah, how tall do you feel? Like, actually just ask them, how tall are you in inches or centimeters or whatever your unit of measurement is. Just ask them, like, report how tall you are in this unit of measurement. So aside from using specific scenarios or quantitative responses, you might also use behavioral observations. You might say, observe someone just kind of hanging out day to day and mark down how many times they do a certain thing. So let's say it's about exercising. Instead of asking someone, do you feel like you exercise a lot? You might say, see them at the gym. And for a quantitative response, you could say, how many hours do you spend in the gym? Or for kind of a behavioral observation, you might observe them in the gym and kind of make notes like, okay, they work this many minutes on this machine, and then you kind of log how many minutes they spend doing various exercises. The takeaway of all of this, though, is that when you conduct research, you need to think about various biases that can impact your results. That way, when you find something and you're interpreting your findings, you can be relatively sure that your interpretations aren't being affected by a third variable or by some kind of bias that was introduced through your methods.